Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all here on a Sunday morning. Before I talk about why we are here today, I just wanted to give you two lines on some of your fellow spectators in the audience, and that is the lovely moon children that we have, which is we are doing a special lot in our auction to raise money for the Jaiva Keel Foundation. And these are the moon children that have been created by the Moon Ray Craft Collective to celebrate the spirit of inclusion. And it's a special collaborative project which you can read more about in our catalog as well. And with that, I'd like to move on to our talk for today, which is titled Raja Ravi Varma, The Making of an Artist and a Nation. We have Manu S. Pillai. Manu S. Pillai is the author of the critically acclaimed The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, and The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. Formerly Chief of Staff to Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, he is also a winner of the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2017. His essays and writings on history have appeared in The Mint Lounge, The Hindu, The Hindustan Times, The Open, The New Statesman, and several other publications. His most recent book, False Allies, focuses on the princely age in India and the Maharajas, specifically at the time of Raja Ravi Varma. So we look forward to a wonderful conversation. He will be in conversation with my colleague Rob Dean, who is a specialist in modern art. I hand you over to Manu and Rob.
Thank you, Malika. As you can tell, the person who knows something about the topic is actually sitting on that side. I'm just directing the questions to Manu. But before we start delving into Raja Ravi Varma in detail, I just wanted to show you slides of the three paintings that you can see on view today, just round the corner here in this gallery. So after the talk is over, please do actually take a look at the art. And this is a detail of the first painting, titled Yashoda Krishna, and the full painting is on the right, and on the left-hand side is an oleograph of the same work. It's relevant that we're showing the oleographs because all three of these paintings that we will be offering in our auction were once part of the Fritz Schleicher collection, and Fritz Schleicher was the German gentleman who in the late 19th century, Raja Ravi Varma sent his secretary to Berlin, and by chance came across Fritz Schleicher, who was a trained printmaker, and they agreed terms, and Fritz Schleicher came over and worked for the Raja Ravi Varma press. Importantly for us, he also eventually bought the press from Raja Ravi Varma in 1903, and the works that were in the press at the time, including the work, this and Shankar, the Holy Family. Again, the full painting is on the right, and the oleograph is on the left. In this, just go back to in this instance, the oleograph on the left has sort of silk additions and sequins, which sort of became quite popular at the turn of the century. The next slide is the final canvas of the group. It's two subjects, but it is in one canvas. This isn't a mistake. The work on the left, obviously, is Krishna killing Kamsa, and the work on the right is unfinished. We don't know why it was unfinished, but in terms of artistic process, I find it very interesting. You can tell how the artist was reworking the image itself, but we'll come back to that later. So you've got a sense, and then finally there's a sketchbook of multiple images from his last series of paintings before he passed away. So Manu, before we dive into Raja Ravi Varma, your book is covering, or multiple books are covering, more the period into which Raja Ravi Varma was born. 1848, he's born and he dies in 1906. It's a very important moment of sort of transition in India. Can you tell us a little bit more about just the environment in which he found himself?
Thanks, Rob. I must first warn everybody that I'm slightly unwell, so I'm pumped full of antibiotics at the moment. So in case I sound like I'm slurring or something, it isn't alcohol, it is the antibiotics. Coming to your question, Rob, Ravi Varma was born in 1848, and what we find since we're sitting in Bombay is that already from the late 1830s and 40s, India is changing. There's a class of young Indians who have emerged, and they're in the process of questioning the British. So there was in Bombay, I forget the name of the paper, but there was a young chap actually in his 20s who would write a letter to the editor of the paper, and they were all signed a Hindu, in which there you find the first, I think, sustained critique of the British Raj. But even as that sentiment was growing, by the time Ravi Varma was 9, we had another big event in India, which was the Great Rebellion of 1857. Now, this convinced, by the time he came into manhood, by the time he grew up, that experience showed most of his contemporaries that violence against the British wasn't going to help. The British were going to be stronger always. We had tried to be violent, we had tried to push them out using military means in 1857. It didn't work. So next, through the course of Ravi Varma's life, practically to the year of his death, nationalism in India was constructed in a elite kind of space. English-speaking, anglicized, Western-educated young men, slightly older men also maybe, like Dadabhai Nauroji. These were the people determining what Indian nationalism should be like, how it can be communicated, how it can be represented, and so on. And that's where Ravi Varma becomes interesting, because his work in many ways reflects a lot of these trends. His depicting of goddesses was something that was done in a way that would appeal to a pan-Indian audience. Because if you look at one of the earlier paintings you were showing of Shiva and Parvati, she's wearing the Maharashtrian sari, which somebody in Kerala might not relate to, or somebody in North India might not relate to. This was a time when even, there's a funny anecdote in M.G. Ranaday's wife's memoirs, I think, 19th century figure, about how they go up to Punjab at some point on a trip, and she goes to the riverside to bathe or whatever. And she goes in wearing her sari. And all the Punjabi women say, why are you wearing your sari when you're taking a bath? And she says, well, this is what we do in Maharashtra. And they said, this is not what we do in Punjab. Because even bathing styles were different. There was that much diversity, that much difference. People didn't look the same, didn't eat the same food. They came from different language areas and so on. Because of which, constructing a sort of slightly more uniform, appealing image was something Ravi Varma did, and he did it consciously. So already in the 1870s, when he's in the Travancore court, training to become the man he would, you have a governor of Madras writing about how Indians just need to apply the national pencil to their own epics and mythology and create a national imagery. Now, we don't know if Ravi Varma actually read this, but considering that he was in the Travancore Maharaja's court as a young boy, as a teenager, and that court had lots of dealings with the governor of Madras, it's possible this reflects a broader conversation that was taking place. There were broader things and broader influences at play, and he was definitely influenced by these. And that affects his work. By the time he dies in 1906, however, a new crop of young men have emerged. Ravi Varma is in his 50s by then. There's a new crop of young men who've emerged who no longer want to do nationalism through petitions and through speeches and through pious remarks addressed to the Queen. Instead, it's a more firebrand version of politics. These congressmen were called extremists as opposed to the moderates. So, and Ravi Varma's death and his sort of dethroning by the art community also, it coincides with 1906, because that's when the partition of Bengal takes place, Congress becomes more fiery, and they look down on Ravi Varma and say, look, this man was just aping the West. He was just copying a Western style of painting, and just because he painted Indian subjects, it doesn't change the fact that he was a colonized mind. And that's where Ravi Varma goes out of fashion. But as you were alluding to earlier, his birth here and his death here, they almost bookend an interesting moderate phase in Indian politics.
Yeah. So we'll return to the question of sort of nationalism in his work and his fall out of favor. But can you tell us a little bit more about his early career? Because there's a lot of sort of myth surrounding his early days. Who was he taught by? Was he taught? Was he self-taught? Was he divinely inspired? I mean, of the sort of two names that consistently come up, you have Theodore Jensen, who was in the Travancore court in 1863. And we also have a sort of lesser talked about figure, Ramaswamy Naidu, who certainly won the prize, I believe, in Shimla in 1874 for painting in the British academic style. And so you have sort of two figures that were clearly around at the time of his sort of early part of his career. Do we know much from his diaries and the other historical records of how he really learnt his trade?
His early years are actually quite interesting because he was a young man, he was interested in painting, but what set him apart was that he was interested in painting as a career. Now, he was born into a landowning family. They had 12,000 acres. That family regularly supplied husbands to the princesses of Travancore. It was a matrilineal system, so the husbands went to the houses of the princesses. His family used to supply these husbands. There's even a story that in 1862, he was first taken to the court as a potential candidate for the then junior Rani of Travancore. But she said, no, he's too dark, and that's why he was sent back. It's an apocryphal tale because in reality, the Rani was already married by the time Ravi Varma got there. But again, it was used by Ravi Varma's own mythologists, as it were, to suggest that thank God he was spared the royal marriage because that's why he could become a great artist. If he had been forced to marry the princess, he would not have had the freedom to go around India to paint and do the kind of things he wanted to do. Then, of course, there are stories where he exorcises spirits. There's a Brahmin girl he meets somewhere in North Kerala, and her father, the priest, is very upset that there's some spirit that's colonized her person. And Ravi Varma comes and he chants a few mantras and sort of gets the spirit out of her body. There's a rather amusing story about how he was such a talented painter in a God-given way that when an English lady poo-pooed the capacity of Indians to paint in the realistic style, he said, why don't you come for dinner and I'll show you a good painting. And then she walks in and she walks to the dining table and she's trying to sit down. That's when she realizes everything there is a painting. It's such wonderful 3D effect that the dining table, the guests, they're all part of a painting. Obviously, it's another apocryphal tale, just to show, oh look, an Indian beats the Westerner. This is a nameless white lady, but Ravi Varma is clearly the hero because he's the one who shows her place and so on. These myths, in fact, come from his beginning itself. There's this whole story that when his mother was pregnant with him, she was taken over by a spirit, a yakshi. And a priest had to come and sort of coax the yakshi out and plant her in a separate shrine. That shrine does exist in his ancestral home. So in all likelihood, his mother had some kind of a fit when she was pregnant. And in those days, they would have thought this was some kind of a divine thing. But all of these stories are trying to suggest that Ravi Varma was inspired in some unique way. That art sort of flew to him from the heavens and he just sort of pulled out magic and did wonderful things. In reality, that's not the case. He moved to the Travancore Darbar. He looked at the artists who were already there. There were already realistic painters in Travancore from the 1820s, 30s. As early as the 1810s, we see the Travancore Rani acquiring European paintings through some kind of an agent. So obviously, he wasn't the first. What sets him apart from Ramaswamy Naidu and the other Naidu painters of the Travancore court was class. Ravi Varma was elite. He was from a Kshatriya family. He was related to the Maharaja of Travancore. He was a social equal. The Naidu painters, who were just as gifted, just as talented, they were Shudra artists who had come from somewhere else, and they were dependent on the stipend they received from the Darbar. Ravi Varma wasn't dependent on that. He came from the aristocracy. Which is why in later years also, even though the Naidus did travel, they also went to Baroda, they also went off to other states. Ravi Varma always held the upper hand because he would enter these states as an equal to the royal families there, as somebody who was of the same class as those people. Which meant that a lot of the emphasis given to Ravi Varma as though he was the first to do this and so on, it's overstated. There were plenty of talented artists, but what helped him was class, position, added to which was a desire to be a professional and somebody who wouldn't just rest on his privilege, but would actually use it to take it to the next level.
And how radical would it have been for a person of his status to become an artist? I mean, I believe there were maybe amateur artists within the family anyway, but would it have been quite shocking to the royalty for him to have taken this decision, or?
I think it would have been shocking when he started painting for money. Painting by itself wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in his own family, the tradition goes that it was the women of the family, 2 generations before his grandmother's time. They were the ones who first picked up painting. His own uncle, whose name was Raja Ravi Varma, he was not only an artist in the Tanjore style, he'd picked up some rudimentary skill when it came to oil paintings. He used to carve on ivory, and there's this Indra's elephant that he's carved that people have told me about. So they were gifted people in his family. His mother used to write plays. But none of them did this for money. None of them did this as a vocation. Whereas he opted to do this as a vocation, thereby rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. So within his own family, there were people who looked down on him, saying you're demeaning your family's honor by going out and sort of, standing in the lobbies of assorted Maharajas, hoping they'll give you a commission. You don't need it. His wife didn't necessarily understand why art, drove him to actually leave her and travel all over India. He would not see her for months on end, sometimes a couple of years. It would take that much time for them to meet. There's even a rather amusing story about how when he died, there was still so much contempt for painting in the way that he did it, that his unfinished canvases were torn up and used to cover pickle jars in Kilimanur Palace, his ancestral home. Obviously, again, I think it's an exaggeration. I don't think they would have done that, because by then he had established himself, he'd got a decoration from the British and so on. But it was unusual for a man of his class and his position to go out and become a professional painter. And he did hustle, as to use a very contemporary word. He did write to assorted Maharaja saying, look, will you give me a commission? He did write to Madhav Rao saying, you promised me a couple of years ago you would invite me to Baroda, why haven't you yet? So he didn't hesitate to stand in queues, to wait for people, and behave like a professional, even as he made full advantage of his networks, his social capital, and his class privilege.
And what do we know about, you mentioned that he sent letters. How did he really go about getting these commissions? Because initially it was quite localized, and then suddenly in about 1880 there's this sort of expansion, and he's rushing all around India.
That again I think comes down to networks, because he arrives in Travancore at the Darbar in 1862, and the first time he leaves the state is 1878, when he goes to Pudukkottai, which is in Tamil Nadu. And how does that commission happen? Almost by chance. He's coming back from Madras, where he's displayed his paintings at one of the fine arts exhibitions. And at one station where he's got to change trains, he runs into an old friend. The friend is the ex-chief minister of Travancore state, whose name is Sir Sheshaya Shastri. And Shastri is now the regent of Pudukkottai. And Shastri says, oh wait, good that I met you here. I've just taken over as regent. Would you like to come to Pudukkottai and paint the royal family there? Ravi Varma says yes, and he goes. And that's the first time he steps out of Travancore and the Madras circuit and serves another princely court. And he, of course, flatters the Raja there very well, because the Raja was actually a very weak figure politically. But he produces this rather grand painting of him standing, looking as if he's fully in charge. And clearly the Raja liked that, because he'd be called back a few years later to do another set of paintings in Pudukkottai. Again, he ends up in Baroda in 1881, because another ex-chief minister of Travancore, Sir T. Madhav Rao, had become regent over there. So Madhav Rao then invites Ravi Varma, when Ravi Varma writes a letter to him and tells him the Maharaja of Baroda is about to be is invested with full powers. Why don't you come and do a state portrait? Ravi Varma goes and is introduced to the Raja. And this same Maharaja, Sayajirao Gaikwad III, almost a decade later gives him one of his biggest commissions, 50,000 rupees, for that entire set of paintings that we now see in Baroda Palace. Those paintings in turn were mythological in their theme. He had the money and the capital to now invest in a press, and that's what leads to his more enduring popularity among a larger audience, because through the press he's able to take his art out into the world, into a much more democratic space, I would say, out of the palaces where more middle class people live. So networks, his capacity to write to people without any sense of shame or hesitation, his drive that he wanted to actually be a professional artist, all of these contributed to him getting the commissions that he did.
And your book, False Allies, sort of covers quite a lot of the royal portraiture that he was commissioned to do. And I love the approach that you're sort of taking an almost inverted art historical approach, where you look at the painting and you go back to say what was the patron wanting to achieve with this work. How much of a sort of backwards and forwards was there between patron and artist in terms of these types of portraits? And
it varies, I think, because if you look at his brother's diaries and the writing from the time he went to Udaipur and painted the Maharana of Udaipur, they're not able to figure out what the Maharana wants. Firstly, the man's never free to sit for paintings. He's always disappearing on hunts. So every time they prepare the studio and they're expecting him to arrive, they get a note saying, oops, Maharaja heard about some tiger somewhere and he's just disappeared for the next 5 days. They luckily used to work with photographs also, so maybe that helped. But often patrons would come and tell them exactly what they wanted. Someone like Sheshaya Shastri would put an order saying, I want a copy of the exact painting that was presented to the Prince of Wales. And then Ravi Varma would do a copy and send it to Sheshaya Shastri. The facial features, he, I think after a while, figured out that people wanted to look nicer in their oil paintings than they did in real life. And therefore, he didn't hesitate to cater to that need. So, with the exception of perhaps his mother-in-law's painting, where she looks rather fearsome.
Which is a rather scary lady.
She is a very scary lady.
And was she in reality? Was she?
She was a scary lady.
Yeah, okay.
Because we also have photographic evidence of the same lady. And just as she glares out of the Ravi Varma painting, she glares at the photographer, at the camera also. But maybe he was also, it was a bit of a joke when he painted his mother-in-law that way. But it's a splendid painting.
Yeah.
So there would be some back and forth that way. He sometimes did paintings for family members, for relatives. He famously did one of his wife, and I don't know how the wife responded to it. But again, he's made her look prettier than she actually was in real life. So maybe it was a peace offering after one of their famous quarrels. They didn't get along. So yeah, there was involvement sometimes like that. But I think over a period of time, he himself realized that patrons want to look and seem and project a better image than they might have in real life. So all the Rajas he painted were genuinely therefore shown as these very masculine figures, and to each he would tailor it in interesting ways. So if you look at the Mysore Maharaja's paintings, Mysore was taken over by the British for 50 years because they said the previous Raja was useless. When it was handed back to the young prince who was adopted as the new Maharaja, both the paintings Ravi Varma did, there's a kind of restlessness in the man. In one painting, he's standing with his arm like that on his hip, almost as if he's just waiting for this painting session to be done so he can get off and get back to doing business. Another one, he's sitting in an armchair, but it looks like he's about to rise, and he's again very restless in that. Because the Mysore Maharajas consciously projected an image of themselves, not as Maharajas who rode elephants and watched dancing girls, but as Maharajas who were focused on industry, education, modernity. And therefore, although he's wearing an Indian achkan and he's got his jeweled buttons and so on, he's also a man of business. And this, you see, if you compare it not just with the painting, but written evidence, you see this was part of the Mysore Maharaja's self-image. Because when the new Maharaja came to power around 1900, there's an official state publication that says His Highness dealt with 900 files in his very first year. Now, all these Rajas' ancestors would probably have rolled their eyes because princes aren't meant to sit like bureaucrats at a desk transacting business like that. They're royalty. But because of colonial influences, because there was a pressure that India must progress and modernize, the princes also responded to that, and they would also want to be painted in ways that reflected both their connection to tradition, but also their place in the contemporary world as men of a modern age. So even in the Pudukkottai painting, if you look at it, the Raja is standing, he's got a table next to him. Behind him you see his ancestral temple, which represents tradition, as it were. And on the table are a series of English books, which is suggesting that the Raja is a man of the modern world who's very comfortable in English and therefore part of a cosmopolitan existence as well. So it's past and present and the hopes of a future all condensed into one canvas. And that Ravi Varma, I think, after a while became quite good at in terms of, giving his patrons exactly the image they wanted to show the world.
So you have this, on one side you have the royal portraits, and then on the other side you have the religious paintings, initially commissioned for largely for royalty and noblemen or people of status, and then there's clearly in the late 1880s this or in fact probably the middle of the 1880s, this sense that he wants to do more, he wants his artwork to be more universally available. What do you think was really the driving force behind the press? Do you think it was a genuine sort of nationalistic fervor, or do you think it was commercial, or a mixture of multiple
I think a mixture
things?
of all of these things, right? Because nothing is as simple as it seems ever. In most cases, there are multiple things happening at the same time. Ravi Varma very rarely, I don't think I've ever read anything where he's expressing a political opinion of any kind. He was fixated on art, and that was about it. Yet we do find that they did attend Congress meetings. He and his brother judged, I think, the industrial and arts segment of one of the Congress meetings that took place in the early 20th century. they were speaking to men who were involved in the Congress. Sayajirao Gaikwad was a big patron of the Congress party. Sir T. Madhav Rao was part of the Congress, and he was one of Ravi Varma's supporters. Sheshaya Shastri used to write favorable things about the Congress. So he was around people who were definitely influenced by nationalism, and they were the ones who suggested certain things to him. So Madhav Rao was the one who in the early 1880s told Ravi Varma, you're doing great paintings, including of the gods and so on, but these are only hanging in palaces and in the halls of the rich. How do you take this out to the people and help build a kind of cultural imagery that everybody can associate and relate to? Now, that's when Ravi Varma hears about this for the first time. It takes him about 10 years to actually establish the press and do what he after that does. He's also printing not just pictures of gods, but also nationalist heroes. So he's printed an image of Tilak, who was one of these firebrand politicians of the Congress party. I think he did something on Gokhale. He did something on Chhatrapati Shivaji. This is all helping feed a mood of cultural nationalism in the country at that time. As I said earlier, the very first meeting of the Congress party in 1885, the circular that went out to invite delegates from around the country required them to speak the English language because none of them had a common language otherwise. There's a press report from that first meeting which says that, all the people, it didn't feel like a political meeting, it looked like a fancy dress ball because the South Indians are wearing something, the people from Peshawar are wearing something else, the Hyderabadis are wearing something else. They really do look like they've come together for a fancy dress party. But what they were doing is constructing a moral case for nationalism. And in that, Ravi Varma ended up contributing by helping create certain visuals which work for us even now. If you ask an average Indian now to shut their eyes and think of Lakshmi or Saraswati, more often than not, it's the Ravi Varma version that will come to their minds, not temple sculptures, not something from an earlier period. It's that Victorian era, Victorianized goddess that they will see. It's telling that these Ravi Varma goddesses all have these high neck blouses and long sleeves and so on, whereas Indian temple sculptures usually have topless women. But again, times had changed by then, and he was helping construct something that was both modern in the sense that it was influenced by Victorian ideas, but all the same it was Indian enough for Indians to relate to it.
So this painting of the Holy Family, you get all the elements of traditional Indian painting. You could have a Kangra or a Gulair painting of Shiva and family seated up in Mount Kailash and usually not seated on a throne, normally on a blanket and up in the hills. But you've got some slightly strange elements in the painting if you look more closely. Although Shiva his hair is tied up as an aesthetic, and he has his royal diadem, that's all quite Indian, but he seems to be sporting a rather Victorian moustache. I mean, this has sort of come off a colonel in the British Army, really. It's a slightly odd addition, in my opinion. And then also you have this throne, which is potentially not a traditional way of representing the Shiva family in Mount Kailash. And the throne had these two rather bewildered-looking lions, which in sort of my eyes seems to be a sort of quietly nationalistic statement in itself. That the Brits may be in control of India at present, but Lord Shiva is firmly sitting on top of the throne. Is that pushing the imagery too far, or do you think there would have been a subtle sort of understanding?
Well, looking at it, one thing that appeals to me is that Ravi Varma was the product of a matrilineal society, where interestingly this format of husband, wife, children was very rare. It was brother, sister, and the sister's children. That was the family unit. And Ravi Varma, we know, was influenced by a more patriarchal idea of what the family should be like, because even in his famous picture of his daughter and grandson called There Comes Papa, scholars have asked, why is the painting titled There Comes Father? Because the father was a non-entity in matrilineal families. There was no place for the father in the matrilineal household. It was the uncle who mattered. But because it was also oriented to a Western audience or a Westernizing audience, I suppose he had to stick to a more conventional idea of family rather than what he wanted to show or what his culture suggested. But this painting is also interesting because the other painting where he's painted Shiva is where Ganga is descending from the skies. And we know that the man who modeled for that painting was also an artist called Parameshwaram Pillai, who was a disciple of Ravi Varma. So he had a huge moustache. There are photographs of him. And I have a suspicion it was perhaps his face that was used for this also.
Okay.
And that's why Shiva appears here with a lot of facial hair, which is quite unusual. Even in temple bronzes and so on, we don't usually see Shiva with facial hair.
We have a sketchbook in the sale, sketchbook number 9, which actually was one of the last sketchbooks from his career. If you just flick on to the next few slides, you can see that there are preparatory drawings for many of the famous paintings from almost his last commission. So we have Ravana abducting Sita, and then going on, Indrajit presenting the trophies of conquest, Rama threatening the ocean, and next one, and Bhishma's real self-sacrifice, and finally Krishna releasing his parents after he's killed Kamsa, which obviously relates to the painting we have here. We know obviously that there was this process of sketching and preparatory drawings for the larger format works. You touched on briefly that he also used photographs. How important was photography, do you think, for the Raja Ravi Varma studio? And also, obviously, his brother was involved in the process. We don't, or I'm not aware from the diary how much, it doesn't sort of say, oh yes, he painted top left-hand corner of this painting. Do we know how much sort of studio involvement there was in these large format commissions?
Can we go back to the first of the sketches that we saw? Yeah, this one. So again, it's interesting that the enterprise that Ravi Varma had was obviously a very professional enterprise. His brother did help him a great deal. People often reduce the brother to an assistant, and the brother didn't seem to mind because he was 12 years younger, and in matrilineal households that hierarchy matters. So he almost looked up to Ravi Varma as a father figure rather than as a brother. But looking at his diaries, you're aware that they often painted together. Even if Ravi Varma's was the signature that showed up in the end, Raja Varma was very much a part of that, and he at one point pointedly says that much of the money that my brothers made is a result of our joint work. In fact, from the time Ravi Varma leaves Travancore for the first time and goes to paint in Pudukkottai in 1878, this young chap is with him. He's a teenager at that time, but he's already helping his brother. And he does that for the next 25 odd years till he dies in the year 1901. And that crushes Ravi Varma, and Ravi Varma's young son steps in and he starts assisting the father. So firstly, there was assistance. Even the kind of time they took to finish a commission, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes a month, it's simply possible because you have others assisting you in actually creating those works. So the mythification of Ravi Varma in some ways also eclipses the contributions of his younger brother. And the sad reality is that the younger brother, by the time he sort of asserted himself and said, look, I'm maybe not an equal, but I deserve some kind of recognition. And they start signing the paintings together, the brother ends up dying. So that's why another reason why he's forgotten. But also the way this modeling was done for these paintings and these sketches were made. For this painting, there's a very well-known story about how in Kilmanur he was planning this painting, and he got a rather fearsome-looking relative of his, dark and hairy and all of that, to come and stand in for Ravana. And he was looking for a suitable girl to play Sita's role, and he found a little girl. And this must have been some niece of his. This girl was brought closer. By then, all her friends and relatives were around, everybody had gathered. And she felt very shy, so she covered her face like that. And he saw that, and he said, that's how I'm going to paint Sita as well. And that's why you have Sita like this, and Ravana is the other relative of his who was dark and tall and broad and all of that. If you can go to the next one. Now here, what's interesting is if you look at the parasol holder, and I think Ravana under the parasol, there's actually a photograph of Ravi Varma himself modeling for this painting. Because I use it in my first book, The Ivory Throne, where Ravi Varma is standing. He's wearing a South Indian munda, torso bare, and he's got an attendant holding up one of these big old parasols over his head. And he's also holding a sword, the Kilmanur family sword. And initially I used it in my book till a friend told me, have you noticed that this is the exact pose Ravana has in this painting? And that's when it struck me that yes, Ravi Varma wasn't a photograph taken randomly. It was taken perhaps as a template for this painting. And he did use photography. We know this because the brothers' diaries refer to the use of photography. Irvin Newmayer's book has the actual photographs of Ravi Varma's daughter who modeled for There Comes Papa. So there's photography there. People who believe in the myth of Ravi Varma won't accept it. They'll say that no, he was divinely inspired. He never made use of any shortcuts like photography and so on. But that's simply not true. The pace at which they were working, the kind of material they were churning out, they would have required that kind of reference material. And there's one more painting after this. Yeah, this I like very much because the guy who's posing as Sri Rama here in Sri Rama Vanquishes the Sea, Ravi Varma's granddaughter, older one, Setu Lakshmi Bai, was the Maharani of Travancore. And again, in the matrilineal system, the Ranis weren't told who to marry. They would be presented with a few boys, and then they would be taken to an upstairs balcony to look at whichever one they liked, and then they would pick whichever boy they preferred. Of course, in those days, they used to look at horoscopes and all of that as well, and it was the priest's job to make the horoscope work. Once the Rani had decided her, who would marry her, that was it. The priest had to work around that. Now, when Ravi Varma's granddaughter, Setu Lakshmi Bai, was 10 or 11 years old, and she was, going to be married, they presented two boys, two brothers. This was the older brother. His name was also Raja Ravi Varma, and the younger brother was Rama Varma. Apparently, this chap was very good looking, used to sort of work out and all of that, had a very good physique. His younger brother was a much more diminutive, smallish kind of teenager, 15 or 16 years old. And the story goes that the Rani looked at them from the window and she said, look, that one's too good looking for me. I'd never be able to hold my own with him. Let me go with a less good looking one on the side because that's just easier in the long term. Which then begs the question, what happened to the good looking one? He ended up joining the Travancore police and he became a DSP of police and ended up retiring and living in Trivandrum in a place called Tamburan Mukka. Which is, I find that very amusing because whenever people go to Mysore Palace and look at this painting of Sri Rama vanquishing the sea, very few have any idea that the Sri Rama in this painting wore khaki shorts and was part of Travancore police until he retired many years later.
Fantastic. And then the amazing thing is that this sketchbook is part of the process for his final commission, the works that end up in Mysore. And it must have coincided pretty closely with the death of his brother. So you actually have this very large commission right at the end of his life where he himself is suffering from diabetes, and yet you still get, I believe, 8 out of 9 canvases were completed in really a remarkably short period of time. And certainly for me, some of those are the best canvases of his career. Can you tell us a little bit about just that last section of...
He was grieving because that's very obvious. There's a Malayalam letter he wrote soon after his brother died, and his son was also unwell. His son had asthma issues and his son was also unwell. And Ravi Varma thought he was going to lose the son also. His wife had died, the brother had died, the son was looking like he was about to die. And Ravi Varma in this letter refers to himself as a sinner, as a papi, and says that, it's my sins that are causing all this damage and so on. Which I thought is an interesting insight into his mind. Officially speaking, in 1905, he's got the Kaiser-e-Hind medal, which Gandhiji would also get at a different period. The Viceroy likes him, the nationalists like him, his work is selling, he's making money. He's also become the eldest member of the Kilimanur family, which means he is now master of these 12,000 acres, elephants, and he's got a huge bungalow and all of that. He's got all the worldly success in that 1 or 2 year period, but then he loses these people. And therefore, he's definitely going through a certain amount of grief when he's doing the Mysore commission. His son's helping him, and I think his son does eventually do a set of paintings for Mysore as well as Baroda. Baroda definitely. And the son tries afterwards to slip into his father's shoes, but it doesn't work. And Ravi Varma was therefore, I think, very fragile in that period. His death was also very sudden. It was they had some kind of a surgical operation, didn't work. Ended up dying just short of 60, 1 or 2 years short of 60, and that was that. So he was, I think, the greatest art has come out at a time when he was emotionally at his most fragile, and indeed he would die by the end of the process.
So you have this almost messianic arrival on the stage as a comparatively young man. He has these mythological attributes. He's sort of divinely inspired. He goes on and creates the press and therefore becomes a hugely popular figure, and his artwork therefore is widely dispersed. And you get this amazing body of work right at the end of his life. But shockingly, when you read the papers, okay, yes, there are very senior figures both within the Raj and Indian nobility mourning his loss, but within a few years he's been trashed. He's sort of being told that he's a calendar artist and that his work is really disregarded. How come there was such a sudden fall from grace?
I think in the very year of his death, there was already a bad newspaper article that came out saying his work is all, wishy-washy nonsense. There's no need to support this kind of art. And again, this links, it wasn't just him or Ravi Varma that fell out of fashion suddenly after 1906. All the people I mentioned earlier, his patrons like Madhav Rao, who was Diwan of Baroda, who in fact ended up writing the first draft constitution that was ever written in India in the 1870s or 80s, Sheshaya Shastri, all of these men of that moderate age of Indian politics and that moderate strategy of dealing with the Raj, subtly pushing back as opposed to, going out there shouting slogans, that entire generation was toppled. In fact, most of us haven't heard of Madhav Rao in today's world, even though in the 19th century he was the tallest statesman that existed in India. Ravi Varma was therefore part of a general movement that toppled a lot of these figures from that period. What happened was that the extremists, as they were called, they became the new force within the Congress party. The Congress party briefly split up as well between the moderates and the extremists. People were getting restless. Revolutionary activity was growing in Bengal. Bombs were being thrown at imperial authorities and so on. At that time, the idea that an Indian artist had borrowed Western techniques and used it for Indian subjects, and that the Raj liked him, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy, who everybody else hated, seemed to like Ravi Varma, all of that went against the artist soon after his death. The Bengal school was also very big on revivalism. The idea that, true nationalism in Indian art would be to revive older forms and older ways of painting in India, which is slightly problematic because while it was emotionally rousing, it assumes that there was one set way of painting before the Raj and we had to revive it. Whereas in reality, art is constantly nourished by multiple influences from all kinds of places. There's no one, it's not a rock solid substance that you put in a gilded cage and lock up and protect and then try to revive separately. It's something that's constantly breathing in lots of influences from other places. As an example, one I typically give is this painting from the Deccan, from the 17th century, commissioned by the Sultan of Bijapur. If you look at it at one glance, it looks like an Islamic princess. She looks like she's wearing Persian clothes, no bindi, none of that. It's a Muslim princess. But then you look closely and you discover it's actually the goddess Saraswati. She's got a veena, she's got a book, she's got all the other emblems of the goddess. And you realize that basically what the Sultan has done is he's taken a Persian style of painting, miniature painting, and applied it to an Indian goddess. Now, if that is seen as a legitimate part of early modern Indian art, Dakhni art or Deccan art, I don't see why Ravi Varma's work, simply because it borrowed a Western style, ceases to be Indian. But what happens is, because it's this time of nationalistic fervor, Gandhiji comes into place. Swadeshi is a big thing. Anything foreign is frowned on. For many, many, many decades thereafter, Ravi Varma is out of fashion. We have a new art movement coming up. People like Amrita Shergill emerge in the 1930s. They're not terribly fascinated by the Ravi Varma style either. In fact, they positively look down on that. The calendar art tag sticks to him, essentially because most people had only seen his prints. They hadn't seen the original paintings, and the prints never looked as good as the original paintings. So because of that, people assumed that was the quality of his work, and he was definitely overstated. His importance was overstated. And it's only in the 1990s again that you find that that entire mood has finally settled. People are now interested in going back in time, and they're a little fairer to Ravi Varma and what he was trying to do in the 19th century. He could not have, I think, done things in the way 20th century artists did a couple of generations later, simply because his context was different, the world was different, the ideas were different, and the strategies of even resisting the Raj at a cultural level, at an emotional level, at a political level, all of this was different. So Ravi Varma has therefore to be seen in his context, in his time, as an artist of that period, not somebody who, will cater to every time and every mood and every fashionable trend that exists in society.
Well, I think that's a very good summary and probably a reasonably good place to stop. There's only one element that has always sort of fascinated me in the larger Puranic paintings. There seems to be a great element of theatricality about it, which is not particularly Victorian in its sensibility. It seems to be more locally inspired, and I believe that you've also noted that sort of interest in local theatre. Can you just elaborate on that a
coming
bit?
From the kind of background he did, as I said, his mother used to write Atakathas, which are Kathakali, plays, as it were. And therefore, he was influenced and he was exposed definitely to that kind of theatrical activity. In his ancestral home, they'd have Kathakali performances regularly, where all the magic was in the face, really, into the expressions that you see. Yeah. So that would definitely have affected him. In general, I think also there was a sense of drama, right? All these Puranic stories have a sense of the dramatic, and therefore the colors that are used, often very bright colors, the facial expressions and so on, it's meant to convey drama. It's meant to rouse emotion. It isn't art for its own sake, it's art trying to push an idea, trying to push or communicate a certain vision of the world. And there I think the theatricality helped, because these stories were sensational. Sita's abduction was a sensational story, and you see that the drama in Ravana, cutting off what's his name, what is the Jatayu's wing, and Sita sort of turning away, and her jewelry is falling off and all of that. It's meant to be that, and that's why the paintings later end up inspiring Dada Saheb Phalke and an entire film industry down to the 80s. Because if you remember, there were these, I wasn't born, but I remember watching it later. There's this whole Ramayana series and the Mahabharata series and all that used to come on TV. And if you look at the costumes, etc., they're wearing, they're very much inspired by a Ravi Varma canvas. Maybe not in a direct way, but it had such an influence in shaping people's ideas about what Puranic scenes should be like, how these gods should be depicted, that ends up becoming the popular mode for TV and film and so on also.
Okay, I've had a fierce look from Priya, so I think we're nearing the end of our official time now. But if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, I'll hand over my mic.
I think Rob would be better to answer the technicalities of that.
Because there's such a huge difference between the original and the oleograph.
Yes, I mean it's a very labor-intensive process where you transfer the image of a painting or sometimes a sketch onto multiple lithographic stones. The best way of explaining it is probably actually to go onto, dare I say it, YouTube, and you can find several museums who take you through the process, because you have to, depending on how many colors you want in the final lithograph, you have to have that number of stones. Each stone has areas covered by sort of wax or a grease, and then where the colors are laid down onto the stone, the rollers come over the top, the paper then absorbs that color. It's then hung out to dry, and then the new stone with the next color is put down, and that paper is returned to the press, and so it's very, very labor intensive. The oleographic press that Raja Ravi Varma had was initially set up in Mumbai, but the plague of 1897 sort of disturbed the whole process. So he moved the press to Malavli. Partly, I think, because Fritz Schleicher, the German gentleman who was assisting him with the printing process, was a great hunter. You see photos in Rupika Chawla's book and from the family archives of this very German-looking gentleman in his hunting outfits, standing in front of numerous dead leopards and nilgai and things, with some rather bored-looking Indian beaters surrounding him. And so I think they moved it out there, and according to the family records, there was a vast cavernous room with multiple stones in it, and the stones had to be kept at a certain temperature. Once they've been used, after about a few thousand prints, the stone is no longer good enough, and you have to repolish the stone to a very fine level of polish before you can put a new print onto it. So it was a very complicated process. And of course, suddenly, again, shortly after Raja Ravi Varma's death, and certainly by the 1930s, 1940s, you get offset printing machines which completely revolutionize printing, make it much less complicated to print in large numbers, and so that type of press sort of fell out of favor. Also, the Raja Ravi Varma press actually burnt down. I believe it's 1969 or 1971, I think. And according to the family, the press burnt for 3 days. They couldn't find enough water to put the to put the fire out because there was so much paper in the press and very little water in the area. So it was a complicated process, and it sort of fell out of fashion because there were new processes. But if you're interested in the actual technique, the best thing to do is actually go and look at a video of them doing it. I had exactly the same problem. I couldn't quite visualize how you get the ink onto the paper, but it's a multiple tiered process essentially. Anyone else?
So, is it a school of Ravi Varma or student of Ravi Varma?
Sorry, we missed the first bit of that.
Some of the paintings has a sign as SRV.
Which paintings? You mean some of the oleographs or?
Earlier paintings, yeah. Actually, my cousin has it at her house, you know.
I think that's probably a question for later. Until I see the work, I'm not familiar with an initialed
Are there
work,
any paintings done by his students or maybe?
Oh yes, yeah. I mean,
So
there's
they
an
used to
ongoing.
sign as SRV maybe?
The influence of Raja Ravi Varma remains huge for many years after his death, and certainly we are very aware of both intentional copies just by people who liked a certain subject, who painted a work exactly in the style of Raja Ravi Varma, and sometimes an exact copy of a composition. And there are also known multiples of Raja Ravi Varma's works that he produced for different patrons. So the process is somewhat complicated. But yes, the son continues to paint in the style of Raja Ravi Varma. I think importantly, you have artists like M.V. Duranda, who worked at the press at the early part of his career, continues to paint in a style that certainly pays deference to Raja Ravi Varma, but then evolves quite rapidly into a unique style themselves. So yes, there is definitely a studio of Raja Ravi Varma and then a style of Raja Ravi Varma that continues to appear for many years.
Also adding to the confusion is the fact that Ravi Varma's sister Mangla Bai, who was also a painter, she had a son who was also a painter, and his name was K.R. Ravi Varma. So you'll find canvases that are signed K.R. Ravi Varma, which people sometimes assume is Raja Ravi Varma, but it's actually the nephew. And the son, of course, painted Rama Varma. He's in fact done similar mythological scenes, not just copies. Sometimes he's taken the story forward. So where Ravi Varma has done Shakuntala in various scenes and settings, he takes it forward in the story, and he's painted more than one canvas of Shakuntala and Dushyanta's court. And it's interesting, in one painting, the Darbar is viewed from this angle, and the other painting is viewed from this angle, and there's a 10-year gap between the two paintings when they were made. So yeah, there are lots of paintings by his students. Mukundan Thambi in Kerala was one student of his, and there's a famous story that said that if Thambi was just a bit more disciplined and didn't have a drinking habit, he would brush us all off the face of the earth. Ravi Varma apparently said this, but Thambi did drink, and therefore he brushed nobody off the face of the world. His student, in turn, Ravi Varma's son's student, N.N. Nambiar, became a big painter in Kerala, also continuing that tradition. So even when Ravi Varma went out of fashion because of the influence of the Bengal school and nationalistic winds, in Kerala, his own family members and disciples kept that style alive. In fact, his granddaughter Setu Lakshmi Bai and the other granddaughter Setu Parvati Bai, who were both Maharanis of Travancore, they patronized a lot of these Darbar artists who continued the Ravi Varma style. And therefore, their private collections even now have Rama Varmas and Mukundan Thambis and all of the successors, even when it was unfashionable. Well, his great-great-granddaughter, who happens to be the current titular Maharani of Travancore, Rukmini Varma, she paints. Her son Jay Varma paints. He's in fact gone abroad and studied, which, Ravi Varma had wanted to go abroad, but in his time it was taboo. A man of his caste position couldn't sail overseas. But his descendant clearly managed, went to America and got formal art school training. So his family members still do paint in that style.
Well, I for one am getting thirsty, so I suggest that we end the formal question and answer. We will be still around afterwards. I think Dadiba just wants to say something.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you, Robin, for a very informative talk. Manu, we all need that medication that you're on because there was no symptoms visible of what you mentioned. And thank you all for making the effort of coming this morning. And please join us for a little food and drink. Thank you.